The old steel groaned under my boots, a familiar song 100 feet above the sea of Douglas firs. For 40 years, I'd called places like Hawks Peak home. This one was my last. The metal catwalk felt colder tonight, the wind biting with a promise of autumn that was still weeks away. My left knee, a mess of pins and scar tissue from a fall back in '98, agreed with the wind. It was time to go. The little house I'd bought on the Oregon coast, with its view of a different, calmer sea, was waiting. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the scent of pine and brewing coffee. A faded photograph of my wife, Martha, was propped against the base of the radio. Her smile was the only thing in this 7 by 7 foot box that wasn't worn down by time and weather. 40 years I'd spent watching for smoke, and now all I wanted was to sit on a porch and watch the tide come in with a woman who was gone. The irony wasn't lost on me. I flicked the switch on the two-way radio. Hawks Peak to base. You read me, Sarah? Static crackled before her voice, clear and steady, filled the small space. Loud and clear, Jack. All quiet on your end? Quiet as a tomb, I said, sipping my coffee. Just the wind for company. Anything for me before I sign off for the night? There was a pause. I could hear the faint rustle of paper on her end. Actually, yes. We have a group of 4 that missed their check-in. A Ford Explorer, Massachusetts plates. They were supposed to call from the Black Creek trail marker at 5 p.m. I glanced at the clock. 8 p.m., 3 hours late. Amateurs, I grunted. Probably lost track of time taking pictures of squirrels. They packed for an overnight? 2 nights, Sarah confirmed. Full gear, according to their permit, just keep an ear out. You know how it is. I knew exactly how it was. Every season, a few tourists thought Whispering Peaks was a city park. They'd wander off trail, get turned around, and we'd spend a day finding them cold, hungry, and embarrassed. Nothing to worry about. I'll take a run up the Black Creek Trail in the morning if we don't hear from them, I promised. Hawks Peak clear. Stay safe, Jack. Base clear. The radio fell silent. I walked to the window, stretching the kinks out of my back. The sun was sinking behind the western ridges, painting the sky in colors I'd never seen before. It wasn't the gentle orange and pink of a typical Montana sunset. This was a deep bruised purple and a furious bloody crimson that bled into the clouds. It looked like the sky was wounded. As the last sliver of light vanished, an unnatural quiet fell over the forest. No bird song, no chirp of crickets. The wind itself seemed to die, leaving a silence so profound it felt like pressure against my eardrums. I stood there for a long time, watching the bruised sky darken to black, a cold knot tightening in my gut. It was probably just the coming storm, I told myself. Just the weather turning. But for the first time in a long, long time, I felt the urge to double-check the lock on the trap door. The morning air was heavy and damp, smelling of pine needles and rain that hadn't fallen yet. The sky was the color of slate. I found their Explorer right where Sarah said it would be, parked at the trailhead, gleaming and out of place against the rugged backdrop of the preserve. A bumper sticker read, "Boston Strong." I sighed, shouldered my pack, and headed up the trail, my boots sinking into the soft earth. The 2-mile hike to the Black Creek campsite was usually a pleasant walk, but today my knee was a throbbing barometer of the foul weather moving in. I found the camp in a small clearing a few hundred yards from the creek, and right away I knew something was wrong. Terribly wrong. 2 high-end dome tents were shredded, not just ripped or torn by a bear, but sliced open from the floor to the ridgepole with a frightening precision. The cuts were clean, almost surgical. Sleeping bags and clothes were strewn across the ground, fluttering in the rising wind, but their expensive backpacks stood neatly against a log. Coolers were closed. A stack of firewood sat untouched next to a cold fire pit. Bears are messy. They maul, they scatter, they eat. A grizzly would have torn into those coolers and packs, scenting the food inside. A mountain lion would have dragged its kill away. But this was an act of vandalism, not predation. I knelt, my bad knee screaming in protest, and ran a hand over the damp ground. There were no signs of a struggle, no scuffed earth, no broken branches, and most unnerving of all, not a single drop of blood. It was as if 4 people had simply vanished into thin air, leaving a vandalized stage set behind them. Then I saw the tracks. They were pressed deep into the muddy bank of the creek. I'd spent a lifetime learning to read the story the forest floor tells, the delicate print of a doe, the heavy tread of a bull elk, the unmistakable shuffle of a black bear. These were none of those. They were long, narrow, and ended in 3 slender toes, each tipped with what looked like a deep claw mark. But the thing that made the hairs on my arm stand up was the 4th digit, set back and to the side, like an opposable thumb. They looked more like the footprints of a giant, deformed primate than anything that belonged in the wilds of Montana. They led from the camp, straight into the dark, impenetrable woods to the north. My heart was pounding a slow, heavy drum beat against my ribs. My training, my 40 years of experience, screamed at me. Call it in. Report everything, exactly as you see it. But my mind balked. What would I say? Sarah, I found a bunch of 3-toed monkey tracks and the kids are gone? They'd think I'd finally lost it. A crazy old man seeing monsters in the mud just weeks from retirement. I pulled out my radio. My hand was shaking slightly. I took a deep breath, forcing the tremor out of my voice. Hawks peaked to base. Go ahead, Jack, Sarah's voice replied. A small comfort of normalcy in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. I found the campsite, I said, choosing my words carefully. It's a mess. Looks like a bear. A big one tore the place apart. No sign of the students. It was the first lie, the one that sealed my fate. I'm going to follow the tracks for a bit. See what I can find. The tracks vanished on rocky ground a quarter-mile north of the camp, leaving me with nothing but a profound sense of unease. I spent the rest of the day on a grid search, my eyes scanning for any sign. A scrap of clothing, a dropped water bottle, anything. I found nothing. By late afternoon, the oppressive gray sky and the throbbing in my knee drove me back to my truck. I needed supplies, but more than that, I needed to be around people, to wash the unnerving silence of the woods out of my head. Graywood isn't much of a town. It's one main street with a diner, a general store, and a bar called the Rusty Spur, where the beer is always cold and the conversations are always old. I was nursing a Coors at the far end of the bar when Ben Black Elk slid onto the stool next to me. He was a tribal elder, a man whose face was a roadmap of long years and hard winters. He didn't say anything at first, just ordered a whiskey and stared into the glass. You look like you've seen a ghost, Stone, he finally said, his voice a low rumble. Just a long day, Ben, I replied, not wanting to get into it. He took a slow sip of his whiskey. I heard about the missing kids. Heard you found their camp. He turned his dark, knowing eyes on me. That look on your face. I've seen it before. On my grandfather. When he would talk about the hungry season. I set my beer down, a little harder than I intended. I'm not in the mood for stories, Ben. "This isn't a story to be told around a campfire," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "It's a warning. My people have lived in these mountains since the mountains were young. We know things. We know that some things sleep. And when they wake up, they are hungry." Despite my skepticism, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. "What things?" "They have no name we speak aloud," he said, his gaze fixed on something far beyond the grimy bar mirror. "They are not spirits. They are not animals. They are a famine-given flesh, a hunger that walks on two legs. They come when the moon bleeds, and they are smart. Smarter than a wolf, smarter than a man blinded by what he thinks he knows." He leaned closer, his voice barely audible. "The worst part, the thing my grandfather always warned of, is the sound. They can steal voices. They listen and they learn. They'll call to you with the voice of a lost child or a friend in need. They use your hope as a lure to draw you into the dark." I finished my beer and stood up, reaching for my wallet. The bar suddenly felt claustrophobic. "I appreciate the story, Ben. Truly. But I think I'll stick with bears and bad weather." He didn't try to stop me. He just nodded slowly, a deep sadness in his eyes. "A man only believes what his eyes will let him see," he murmured. "Just be careful, Jack. The moon will be full tonight. And the sky has been bleeding for 2 days." I walked out into the fading light, the old man's words echoing in my head. I dismissed them as folklore, the kind of spooky tale that every small town has. As I drove the winding road back up to Hawks Peak, I convinced myself I was dealing with a cougar, maybe a pack of them. Something big, something explainable. But as the first fat drops of rain began to splatter against my windshield, I couldn't shake the image of those three-toed tracks, or the feeling that I was driving away from the world of the living and back into something ancient and predatory. I made it back to the tower just as the sky opened up. This wasn't a summer shower. It was a deluge, a vertical river pouring out of a black sky. The wind howled like a banshee, throwing sheets of rain against the cabin windows with the force of thrown gravel. The entire tower, my steel sanctuary for 40 years, swayed on its foundations, groaning under the assault. I turned on the radio, needing to hear Sarah's voice, to confirm the search and rescue team was on its way, to connect to a world that made sense. "Hawks Peak to base, do you copy?" I yelled over the roar of the storm. Only static answered. A wall of white noise. "Base, this is Hawks Peak, come in." I tried again, cranking the volume. Nothing. Then came a flash of lightning so brilliant it bleached the world white for a second, followed by a crack of thunder so immediate and violent it felt like the sky itself had split in two right over my head. The lights in the cabin flickered once, twice, and died, plunging me into darkness. The hum of the radio faded into a dead silence. "Damn it," I muttered, fumbling for my flashlight. The beam cut a shaky circle through the pitch-black room. The main breaker must have tripped. I grabbed my rain gear and headed for the generator shed, a small metal box bolted to the catwalk outside. The wind nearly tore the door from my hand as I wrestled it open. Inside, the backup generator, my lifeline, sat cold and silent. I checked the fuel, pulled the choke, and gave the cord a hard yank. The engine sputtered, coughed a plume of greasy smoke, and died. I tried again, and again. Nothing. It was dead. Back inside, soaked and shivering, the reality of my situation began to sink in. No power, no radio. The single landline, a relic that ran 20 miles through the forest, was undoubtedly down too. I was an island, 100 feet in the air, completely and utterly alone. And then I heard it. Through the symphony of the storm, a new sound emerged. It was high and thin, a keening wail that seemed to cut right through the roar of the wind. It wasn't the sound of any animal I knew. It wasn't a wolf or a coyote, and it certainly wasn't a mountain lion. The wail held for a long, chilling moment, and then it twisted, breaking into a series of sharp, guttural clicks and pops that sounded hideously like laughter. My blood ran cold. I grabbed the flashlight and swept its beam across the windows, trying to pierce the driving rain. I saw nothing but the silver streaks of water and the thrashing shapes of the trees below. But the sound, it wasn't coming from one place. It was everywhere at once. It echoed from the north, then the east, then from directly below me. It was a chorus, a hunting party, calling to one another in the heart of the storm. I backed away from the window, my hand finding the cold, reassuring stock of my Winchester. Ben's words came back to me, unbidden and terrifying. A hunger that walks on two legs. The storm raged outside, but a different, colder storm was brewing inside me. The storm wasn't the enemy. The storm was just cover. The storm ended as abruptly as it had begun. One moment the wind and rain were tearing at the tower. The next, there was only the sound of water dripping from the eaves. The sudden silence was more unnerving than the chaos it replaced. I stood in the center of the dark cabin, every muscle tense, listening. Slowly, like a curtain being drawn back, the thick clouds began to part. A strange, pale light filtered through the windows. I crept over, my heart hammering against my ribs, and looked out. The moon was full, just as Ben had said it would be. But it wasn't the familiar, comforting silver orb of a clear night. It was huge, swollen, and hanging in the sky like a drop of blood. Its light was not silver, but a sickly crimson wash that painted the wet forest in shades of rust and wine. The world below looked alien, diseased. The legend Ben told me slammed into my mind not as a folksy tale, but as a dire literal truth. They come when the moon bleeds. And then I saw them. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the drip line of the giant firs, something moved. A shadow detached itself from the deeper shadows of the woods. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs too long for its body. It moved with a fluid, unnatural grace, stepping into the red moonlight. It wasn't an animal. It stood on two legs, its form vaguely humanoid but stretched and distorted, like a reflection in a warped mirror. Then another one appeared to its left, and a third to its right. Within a minute, the clearing was lined with them. At least a dozen. They didn't make a sound. They just stood there motionless, their silhouettes stark against the blood-red landscape. They were watching the tower. They were watching me. My breath hitched in my throat. I could make out more details now in the gruesome light. Their heads were small and narrow, set atop long, thin necks. Their arms hung nearly to their knees. They were hunters, and they were patient. This wasn't a random encounter. They had been waiting for the storm to pass, for the moon to rise. They had driven me up here, cut me off, and now they were surrounding me. I raised my Winchester, the wooden stock cold against my cheek. I centered the scope on the chest of the nearest one. My finger tightened on the trigger. It was an easy shot, maybe 100 yards, but I hesitated. What was I looking at? What in God's name was I about to kill? They hadn't attacked. They were just standing there, an audience to my terror. As if sensing my intent, the one I was aiming at slowly lifted its head. I couldn't see its face, only the dark shape of it turning towards me. It knew I was there. It knew I was watching. It knew I was afraid. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. The moon bled down on the silent woods, on the ring of impossible figures, and on the old man in the steel cage, realizing with dawning absolute horror that the folk tales were real, and the hunt was about to begin. The stillness broke without warning. One of the figures on the far side of the clearing detached from the line and shot forward, a blur of motion in the red gloom. It didn't run like a man or an animal. It moved in a low, terrifying scuttle, its long limbs eating up the ground at a speed that made my mind reel. It reached the base of my tower in seconds. I didn't have time to think. I tracked it through my scope as it began to climb, its clawed hands and feet finding purchase on the crossbeams of the steel support leg as easily as a squirrel climbing a tree. It was impossibly fast. Instinct took over. The roar of the 30-06 Winchester was deafening in the enclosed cabin. The bullet struck the creature high in the chest, the impact throwing it from the steel leg. It hit the ground with a wet, heavy thud and lay still. I chambered another round, my hands trembling, a wave of adrenaline making my vision sharp and clear. But there was no cry of pain, no blood I could see in the crimson light. And the others, they didn't scatter. They didn't even flinch. They simply watched, their unnerving stillness a stark contrast to the sudden violence. Then the attack began in earnest. It wasn't a mindless charge. It was tactical. Two more creatures broke from the line and sprinted for the tower legs on opposite sides, forcing me to divide my attention. As I aimed at one, a rock the size of a fist slammed into the window next to my head, shattering the pane and spraying me with glass. I ducked, my ears ringing, and saw three more of them, further back, systematically hurling stones at my glass cage. They were trying to break my cover to flush me out. I fired again, hitting one of the climbers. It too fell, but the other was already halfway up. I swung the rifle around, but it was too close, moving too fast under the catwalk for me to get a clear shot. I heard its claws scraping against the metal right beneath my feet. Dropping the rifle, I scrambled for the heavy-duty bear spray I kept by the door. I flung open the trapdoor in the floor just as a long, three-fingered hand reached through the opening. I aimed the canister and let loose a thick orange stream of concentrated capsaicin directly into whatever passed for its face. A sound tore through the night, a high-pitched shriek of what could only be agony. It was a sound that had never been made by a human throat. The hand withdrew, and I heard the creature fall. I slammed the trapdoor shut and threw the heavy bolt, my heart feeling like it was trying to beat its way out of my chest. I grabbed one of the emergency flares from the wall locker, popped the cap, and fired it out of the broken window. The brilliant magnesium glare lit up the clearing, washing out the red moonlight and casting long, dancing shadows. For a moment, the creatures recoiled from the intense light, shielding their heads with their long arms. They were vulnerable to light. It was my only advantage. But the flare burned out in less than a minute, plunging the world back into red-tinted darkness. When my eyes adjusted, I saw they had regrouped. The two I had shot were gone. Not dead, not wounded and crawling away. Vanished, as if they had never been there. And the others were no longer just watching. They were moving, circling the tower slowly, deliberately. They had tested my defenses, they had learned, and the night was still young. The direct assault ceased. Silence, heavy and expectant, fell over the clearing once more. They had tried brute force and failed. Now they were trying something else, something worse. I stood in the center of the cabin, shards of glass crunching under my boots. My breath fogging in the cold night air. My rifle was reloaded, the can of bear spray in my jacket pocket. I was a cornered animal waiting for the predators to make their next move. The wind whispered through the broken window pane, a mournful sound that did little to cover the frantic thumping of my own heart. Then, a voice drifted up from the darkness below. "Jack? Jack, can you hear me? Oh God, please answer me." My blood froze. I knew that voice. It was Sarah, her voice filled with panic and desperation. "Sarah," I called out, my voice hoarse, taking a hesitant step toward the broken window. "Sarah, is that you? Where are you?" "I'm down here, Jack. Our truck broke down, the radio's out. We saw your light. Something's in the woods, Jack. It's hunting us. Please, you have to help." Hope is a cruel, treacherous thing. For a split second, a wave of relief washed over me. I wasn't alone. They were here. But as I leaned forward to peer into the darkness, Ben's warning echoed in my mind. They can steal voices. They use your hope as a lure. The voice was perfect. It was Sarah's tone, her cadence. But there was something wrong with it. A subtle, metallic undertone. A slight, unnatural echo, as if it were being played back from a cheap tape recorder. It was a perfect mimicry, but it lacked a soul. "Who's with you, Sarah?" I asked, playing along, my hand tightening on my rifle. Just me," the voice answered, a tremor of fear in it. "Please, Jack, let down the ladder. I'm scared." My stomach turned to ice. Sarah would never come out here alone, especially not in these conditions. Standard procedure was a team of at least 2, always. It was a lie. A trap. They had been listening. They must have picked up our radio conversations before the storm knocked out the repeater. They were using her voice as bait. "I see you," I lied, my own voice shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. "Stay right there." "I'm coming down." I backed away from the window into the darkest corner of the cabin and waited. The voice called my name again, more insistent this time, laced with a desperate, cloying sweetness. Then came a new sound, a low, rhythmic creaking. Groan, squeak, groan, squeak. It was the sound of stressed metal. I peered through a different window and saw 2 of the creatures at the base of the tower. They weren't climbing. They were pushing against one of the main support legs, rocking back and forth in a synchronized, hypnotic rhythm. Another pair was doing the same on the opposite side. The whole tower was beginning to sway, a gentle, sickening motion that was slowly growing more pronounced. They weren't just trying to get in anymore. They were trying to bring my entire world crashing down. They had analyzed my fortress, found its weakness. It wasn't about breaking down the door. It was about destroying the foundation. I was trapped in a steel box, 100 feet up, and the mice were trying to topple the cage. The swaying of the tower was getting worse. A constant, nauseating rhythm that sent books sliding off my small shelf and made the coffee pot crash to the floor. The rhythmic groaning of the steel supports was a countdown to my doom. They were patient, tireless, and I knew I couldn't let them continue. My bullets were limited, and shooting at them from this angle was useless. I needed something to break their coordinated effort, something to drive them back from the base of the tower. I needed fire. My gaze fell on the 5-gallon can of kerosene I used for the lamps. It was nearly full. An idea, born of desperation and adrenaline, sparked in my mind. It was a wild, stupid gamble, but it was the only one I had. Working quickly, my fingers clumsy in the cold, I looped one end of a rope around the handle of the can. I popped the seal and unscrewed the cap, the pungent smell of kerosene filling the cabin. I dragged the heavy can to the broken window, the tower lurching beneath me. Below, 4 of the creatures continued their work, oblivious, their backs to me. "Hey!" I screamed, my voice raw. "Look up!" For a moment they stopped. The groaning ceased. In the eerie silence, 4 heads swiveled and looked up, their faces still lost in the red-tinged shadows. That was all the time I needed. I tipped the can, and a thick, glistening stream of kerosene rained down, splashing over the creatures and soaking the pine needles and damp earth around the base of the tower. They shrieked and scattered, but it was too late. The ground was saturated. I pulled the empty can back in, my heart pounding. I fumbled for my last flare, my hands slick with kerosene. I pulled the cap, struck the igniter, and a blinding white light filled the cabin. Without hesitating, I tossed it out the window. It arced through the air, a falling star of chemical fire, and landed right in the center of the kerosene-soaked patch. The world erupted. A whoosh of sound and a wave of heat washed over the tower as the ground ignited. A wall of orange and yellow flame shot 30 feet into the air, turning night into a terrifying, flickering day. In that brilliant, searing light, I finally saw them, and the sight will be burned into my memory until the day I die. They had no skin. Their bodies were a grotesque mockery of anatomy, all exposed sinew and taut, dark muscle. Their faces were worse. Smooth, skull-like heads with no visible ears or noses. Where their eyes should have been were just deep black pits, empty sockets that seemed to drink the light. And their mouths, gaping holes filled with rows of needle-sharp, interlocking teeth, like a deep-sea predator. The fire didn't just scare them, it enraged them. They writhed and screamed as the flames licked at them, their shrieks a discordant symphony of agony and fury. One of them, larger than the rest, its back crisscrossed with what looked like old, deep scars, turned its eyeless face directly up at me. It opened its nightmarish mouth and let out a piercing, high-frequency screech, a sound that was not a cry of pain, but a command, an order. The others responded instantly. Ignoring the flames, they turned their attention from the tower supports to the forest itself. In a terrifying display of coordinated rage, they began to move toward a massive, dead pine tree that stood 50 feet from my tower. The scarred leader pointed a long, clawed finger at it. Their new objective was clear. If they couldn't knock me down, they would build a bridge. The sound of their claws tearing into the dead wood of the pine tree was like giant termites chewing through the bones of the world. It was a sound of relentless, single-minded destruction. I watched in helpless horror as 3 of them scaled the massive trunk, while others pushed from the base, their combined strength straining the ancient wood. The massive tree began to creak, to groan, its roots tearing from the earth with a sound like a drawn-out scream. I fired my last few rounds from the Winchester, but it was like throwing pebbles at a landslide. One bullet struck a creature on the trunk, sending it tumbling, but another immediately took its place. I was out of time, out of options. With a final, deafening crack, the tree gave way. It fell in agonizing slow motion, its branches scraping against the sky before it slammed into my tower with the force of a battering ram. The entire structure shuddered violently, and for a terrifying second I thought it was all over. But the old steel held. The top of the pine tree, however, had punched through the roof of my cabin, its splintered branches creating a jagged, horrifying bridge from the forest canopy directly to my sanctuary. They were coming. I scrambled back from the wreckage of the roof, my ears ringing from the impact. There was no time to think. I dragged my small metal desk and cot, barricading the door to the single interior room, a small storage closet. It was a flimsy defense, but it was all I had. I grabbed the fire axe from its bracket on the wall, its weight a small, cold comfort in my hands. The first one landed on the roof with a heavy thud, then another. I could hear their claws scraping on the metal sheeting, a sound like nails on a chalkboard that grated directly on my soul. A long, slender arm, black in the dim light, reached down through the hole in the ceiling, its three-fingered hand flexing, searching. I huddled behind my pathetic barricade, the axe held tight in a two-handed grip. The scraping stopped. Silence. Then, a splintering crash as the main cabin door was ripped from its hinges. They were inside. I could hear their soft, unnerving footsteps, the slight wet clicking sound they made as they moved. They were investigating the main room, testing the barricade. A clawed hand punched through the thin wooden door of the closet, splintering the wood just inches from my face. I swung the axe wildly and was rewarded with a sharp shriek of pain. The hand withdrew. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time had ceased to have meaning. All that existed was the darkness of the closet, the burn of adrenaline, the weight of the axe, and the sounds of the things just outside the door, waiting. They were toying with me, I realized. They could have torn their way in at any moment. This was the part of the hunt they savored. The terror of the cornered prey. Exhaustion was a physical weight, pulling my eyelids down, making the axe feel like it was made of lead. My shoulder was on fire where a piece of the ceiling had struck me. I was bleeding, broken, and running on fumes. Through a crack in the closet wall, I saw a change in the quality of the light outside. The blood-red glow of the moon was fading, replaced by a faint, pearlescent gray on the eastern horizon. Dawn. The creatures on the other side of the door became agitated. I could hear them making low, guttural, hissing sounds. The scratching on the walls grew frantic, desperate. As the first true ray of sunlight pierced the canopy of the forest and sliced through the broken window of the cabin, the sounds intensified into shrieks of what sounded like burning pain. The hissing was the sound of sizzling flesh. Then, as quickly as they had come, I heard them retreat. The sound of their claws on the roof, the crash of them leaping from the tree bridge back into the shadows of the forest. Then, silence. A true morning silence, filled with the first tentative chirps of birdsong. I waited, not daring to breathe. 5 minutes. 10. Slowly, painfully, I pushed the barricade aside and stumbled out of the closet. The cabin was a ruin. The world outside was bathed in the soft, clean light of a new day. I was alive, shaking, bleeding, but alive. I had survived. I had won. The morning sun felt like a benediction, warm on my face, chasing away the bone-deep chill of the night. I stood amidst the wreckage of my home, every muscle screaming in protest, and breathed in the clean, pine-scented air. I had made it. The thought was so overwhelming, so intoxicating that I almost laughed. My professional instincts, honed over a lifetime, kicked in before the relief could fully take hold. I needed to assess the situation, to understand what had happened. I grabbed my binoculars from their shattered case. Miraculously, the lenses were intact, and scanned the clearing. The fire had burned itself out, leaving a blackened, smoldering patch on the forest floor. The ground was a chaotic mess of tracks, but they all led in one direction. Not scattered deep into the woods, as I would have expected from fleeing animals, but in a clear, defined path toward the base of the old granite mountain to the north. My eyes followed the trail until it ended at a dark, gaping hole in the rock face. The entrance to the abandoned Blackwood mine, shut down since the 50s. They weren't gone. They were hiding. They had a lair. The sun wasn't a weapon that killed them. It was just an inconvenience that drove them indoors. Like bats. A knot of ice formed in my stomach, chilling the warmth of the sun. The fight wasn't over. It had just been paused. Then my gaze drifted down toward the park road, miles away but clearly visible from my perch. And what I saw next drained every last drop of triumph from my body. The student's Ford Explorer was still parked at the trailhead, but another vehicle was pulling up beside it. A plain, windowless white van. 2 men in flannel shirts and jeans got out. They didn't look like a search and rescue team. They moved with a casual, bored efficiency. They opened the back doors of the van and 2 more people, a man and a woman looking pale and disoriented, climbed out. For a horrifying moment, I thought they were 2 of the missing students, that these men were rescuers after all. But they weren't. The 4 of them stood there for a moment. They weren't looking around for help or checking a map. They were all staring in the same direction, not at the road, not at the sky, but directly toward the Blackwood mine. One of the men from the van raised his hand, not in a wave, but in a strange, sharp gesture, like a conductor queuing an orchestra. And from the deep woods, from the direction of the mine entrance, came a faint but distinct reply. A single, high-pitched click. The same sound I'd heard the creatures make before they laughed in the storm. The man nodded, satisfied. He and his partner herded the other 2 back into the van, shut the doors, and drove away, leaving the Explorer behind. I lowered the binoculars, my hands numb. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying, soul-crushing certainty. The students weren't the victims. They were bait. The shredded camp, the lack of blood. It was all a stage set to draw people like me in. And the men in the van, they weren't rescuers. They were keepers, or ranchers. They had brought their flock to a new pasture. The 4 students were just the first meal to get them settled. I looked at the ruined tower around me. At the bridge of dead wood leading straight to my door. I hadn't survived a siege. I had merely weathered a passing curiosity. I wasn't a victor watching the enemy retreat. I was the leftover food in the pantry after the owners had had their dinner. And I knew with a certainty that was colder and sharper than any fear I had felt during the long night that the sun was setting somewhere. And the owners would be back. They would be hungry. And this time they knew exactly where I was. Story 2. The rain here in the Olympic doesn't fall so much as it breathes. It's a constant silver mist that hangs in the air, clinging to the shaggy green coats of moss on the Sitka spruce, and turning the forest floor into a dark, quiet sponge. Most people find it oppressive. For me, it's a blanket. It muffles the world, quieting the ghosts that followed me from Seattle. Out here, the only sounds are the drip of water from 6-foot-tall sword ferns and the call of a raven, a lonely croak that gets swallowed by the silence. My patrol route is a looping 14-mile trail that I could walk in my sleep. It's my penance and my peace. A sudden snap of a branch to my left made me flinch, my hand instinctively dropping to the Glock on my hip. It was just a deer, a doe with eyes like black oil, and she bounded away into the emerald gloom. But for a half-second, I wasn't in the Hoh rainforest. I was back on a wet Seattle street, the world a chaos of strobing red and blue lights reflecting off shattered glass. the pop, pop, pop of gunfire echoing in the concrete canyon. I blinked, the memory receding, leaving the familiar metallic taste of adrenaline in my mouth. My partner, David, had followed the book. I hadn't, and now he was dead, and I was here, talking to trees. The storm had been threatening all day, the sky a bruised purple gray. My radio crackled to life, the dispatcher's voice shredded by static. Issing hiker, last seen near the Hall of Mosses, solo male. The signal died, dissolving into a hiss. Standard procedure for a lost hiker was to coordinate a search from the ranger station, but the sky was opening up. The drizzle turned into a downpour, and the wind began to howl through the canopy. This guy was on his own until it passed. I was maybe 2 miles from my truck when I saw it, a slash of bright blue nylon against the deep greens and browns of the forest floor. It was a backpack, half buried in the mud at the bottom of a steep 10-foot ravine just off the trail. Scrambling down the slick embankment, I saw the man. He was lying face down, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. His jacket was shredded and dark. Wet patches were spreading across the back of his shirt. I checked for a pulse. Faint, but there. I rolled him over gently. His face was pale, streaked with mud and blood. Deep, parallel gashes ran from his shoulder down his chest, the kind of wounds that looked like they'd been carved out with a rake. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and clouded with pain. He tried to speak, a ragged gasp of air. "Bear," he whispered, the single word a desperate, broken thing. Then his eyes rolled back, and he was gone again. The rain was coming down in sheets now, turning the trail into a river of mud. The road back to Forks would be a washout. My truck would never make it. There was only one option. Heaving him up into a fireman's carry, my muscles screaming in protest, I started the long, slow slog back to my station. He was my responsibility now. The ranger station, my home, is little more than a sturdy log cabin with a generator, a satellite phone that only worked on clear days, and a well-stocked pantry. It's my fortress of solitude. Tonight, its thick walls felt terrifyingly thin. The storm was throwing itself against the windows, and the wind shrieked like something wounded. The satellite phone was dead, of course. The radio just hissed static. The dirt road leading out was now a churning brown torrent. We were completely cut off. I laid the stranger on my cot. His name was Lucas Hale, according to the driver's license I'd found in his wallet. I cut away the remnants of his shirt with a pair of trauma shears from my first aid kit. The wounds were worse than I thought. 4 deep, parallel gouges, starting at his left collarbone and tearing diagonally across his torso. They looked like claw marks, but the spacing was too perfect, too uniform. A bear swipe is a messy, brutal thing. This was almost deliberate. And there were other marks, crescent-shaped bruises on his own arms, deep scratches on his forearms, as if he'd been fighting to hold himself back from something. "This is going to sting," I said, more to myself than to him. He was barely conscious. I cleaned the wounds with antiseptic. He hissed through his teeth but didn't cry out. As I worked, stitching the worst of the cuts with a suture kit, I felt his muscles tense under my fingers. He was lean but incredibly wiry, all coiled strength, not the body of a casual photographer. He woke fully about an hour later, propped up against some pillows, a mug of steaming coffee in his hands. His eyes, a startlingly clear gray, followed my every move. "Thanks," he said, his voice hoarse. "You're a ranger?" "Madison Clark," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "People call me Maddie." "You're a long way off the marked trails, Lucas." He winced, Whether from the pain or my question, I couldn't tell. I'm an amateur photographer. Got turned around looking for a shot. Then, the bear. He was lying. I could see it in the way he avoided my gaze, the slight tremor in his hands. Cops and rangers get good at spotting lies. They have a certain feel to them, a hollowness. But I didn't push. He was hurt, and we were trapped. Antagonizing him wouldn't help. "You're lucky it wasn't a grizzly," I offered instead, sitting down across from him at my small wooden table. "They haven't been seen in this part of the park for decades, but you never know." He gave a weak, humorless smile. "Yeah, lucky." We fell into a quiet, strained conversation. He told me he was an architectural historian from Portland, that he came to places like this to escape the noise. I understood that. I told him about the elk herds that sometimes passed by the cabin, about the way the light looks when it finally breaks through the canopy after a storm. For a moment, the tension eased. He spoke of old buildings with a quiet passion, and I saw a glimpse of the man behind the fear and the pain. We were two strangers hiding from our own kinds of monsters in the deep, dark woods. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that his monster was much, much closer. The storm finally broke sometime after midnight, leaving behind a world wrapped in fog and an unnerving silence. I'd given Lucas the cot and tried to get some sleep in my armchair, a tranq rifle leaning against the wall beside me, standard procedure when there's a potentially aggressive bear in the area. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time I drifted off, I was haunted by the sounds coming from the other side of the room. They weren't the groans of a man in pain. It was a low, guttural rumbling that seemed to vibrate through the cabin's floorboards, a sound that felt too deep, too resonant for a human throat. It rose and fell with his breathing, an animalistic cadence that made the hair on my arms stand up. I told myself it was just a side effect of the trauma, his body processing the shock. I didn't believe it for a second. By morning, Lucas seemed better. Too much better. He was sitting up when I woke, staring out the window at the thick gray curtain of fog. "Morning," I said, my voice thick with sleep. He turned, and I saw the change. The exhaustion was still there, but it was overshadowed by a frantic, wired energy. His gray eyes were wide, darting around the room as if searching for an escape route. He was a caged animal. "How are you know?" I gestured toward his chest. "Better," he said, and his voice was tight. "Much better." I insisted on checking his bandages. When I peeled back the gauze, I had to stifle a gasp. The deep, raw gouges from yesterday, the ones I'd painstakingly stitched shut, were no longer angry and red. They had already started to close. The edges of the wounds were knitting together, looking more like week-old scars than fresh injuries that should have had him laid up in a hospital bed. It was impossible. The human body doesn't heal that fast. "You must have a hell of an immune system," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He just grunted in response, pulling his borrowed shirt back on. He spent the rest of the day pacing, from the window to the door, back to the window. Every snap of a twig outside, every gust of wind that rattled the window pane made him jump. He watched the sky with a desperate intensity, as if he could will the thick clouds to part. I tried to make conversation, but his answers were clipped and distracted. The fragile connection we'd made the night before had vanished, replaced by a wall of sheer panic. Late in the afternoon, as the light began to fade, he stopped his pacing and turned to me. His face was pale, slick with sweat. "Madison," he said, and the casual use of my full name was jarring. What's today's date? It's the 12th, I said, frowning. October 12th. He closed his eyes, a shudder running through him. He looked like a man on death row who had just been told his appeal was denied. And the full moon, he whispered, his voice cracking. Is it soon? A cold dread, heavy and suffocating, settled in my gut. I didn't need to check the calendar on my desk. I knew. I saw it marked there every month. It affects animal behavior, tidal patterns. It affects everything out here. It's tonight, I said. The look on his face wasn't fear. It was something far worse. It was the absolute certainty of damnation. Lucas collapsed onto the cot after my revelation. Not asleep, but in a state of sheer, bone-weary exhaustion. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, his breathing shallow. The tension in the cabin was a physical thing, a pressure building against the walls. My cop instincts were screaming. This man was a danger, but I didn't know to whom or what. My ranger training told me to de-escalate, to wait for backup. But my gut, the one I'd learned to trust after David's death, told me I was out of time. I needed his ID, I told myself. A plausible excuse to justify what I was about to do. I picked up his mud-caked backpack from the floor where I'd left it. It was heavier than it should have been for a day hiker. Inside, nestled between a high-end camera lens and a waterproof jacket, were two objects that made my blood run cold. The first was a small, hinged wooden box. I opened it. Inside, cushioned in worn velvet, lay 5 bullets. They were heavy, with a dull, silvery sheen. They weren't factory-made. I could see the imperfections, the slightly uneven surfaces that spoke of being hand-poured from a mold. They were silver. My grandfather used to tell me stories about silver bullets, old-world folklore to scare the grandkids. It wasn't scary now, it was terrifying. The second item was a journal, bound in dark, cracked leather and held shut by a simple strap. It felt ancient. The paper inside was yellowed and brittle, covered in an elegant looping script that was hard to decipher. The ink was faded, the date at the top of the first page reading June 1888. It was an account, a confession written by a man named Alistair Hale. He wrote of a curse, a beast of the blood that had followed his family from the old country. He didn't use the word werewolf, not at first. He called it the affliction, the change, the red thirst. He described the agony of the transformation in horrifying detail, the feeling of his bones breaking and resetting, his skin stretching and tearing. He wrote of waking up in the woods, covered in blood that wasn't his own, with no memory of the night before. I flipped through the pages, my hands shaking. The handwriting changed several times, growing more modern with each generation. The entries were all the same, a chronicle of pain, of fighting the monster within, of the desperate search for a cure that never came. The last dozen pages were written in a familiar, steady hand, dated only 5 years ago. It was Lucas's father. "He has it," the entry read. I saw the change in his eyes on his 16th birthday, the same fire I saw in my own. I have failed. I have passed on this damnation to my son. I pray he is stronger than I am. I pray he can find a way to cage the beast, not just for a night, but forever. May God have mercy on my boy, Lucas. The journal slipped from my fingers and fell to the floor with a soft thud. I looked over at the man on the cot. He wasn't a liar. He wasn't a threat, not in the way I understood. He was a man living a nightmare passed down through generations. The impossible healing, the animalistic sounds, the terror in his eyes at the mention of the full moon. It all clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The monster the hunters were looking for wasn't in the woods. I had locked it in my cabin with me. A hard, percussive knock on the cabin door made me jump so violently I nearly dropped the journal. It sounded like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. I looked at Lucas. His eyes were wide open, locked on the door. The raw terror was back. I tucked my Glock into the waistband of my jeans at the small of my back and walked to the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. I peered through the peephole. 3 men stood on my porch, dripping wet and illuminated by the cold glare of my exterior light. They wore hunting camouflage and expressions that were a nasty mix of frustration and aggression. I opened the door a crack, keeping my body positioned to block the view of the cabin's interior. "Can I help you?" The man in the center, a big, broad-shouldered guy in his 40s with a trimmed beard and the weary eyes of someone who'd seen too many long nights, stepped forward. "Garrett Shaw. My truck's stuck in the mud about a mile down the road. We saw your light." "Road's washed out," I said, my voice all business. "Nothing I can do about it until morning. You'll have to wait it out." Shaw's eyes narrowed. He glanced past me, trying to see inside. "We're not here for a tow, Ranger. We're hunting." "This is a national park, Mr. Shaw. Hunting is illegal," I stated flatly. "We're not hunting deer," another man, younger and thinner, spat out. "We're hunting the thing that killed Kevin." My blood went cold. The missing hiker. Garrett pulled out his phone, shielding the screen from the rain. He showed me a picture. It was a paw print, pressed deep into the mud. It was shaped like a wolf's, but it was massive, bigger than my 2 fists put together. It was far too large for any known predator in North America. "My best friend Kevin was found torn apart not far from here last week," Garrett said, his voice low and thick with grief. "The sheriff's department called it a bear attack. We know better. We tracked it here." He looked me dead in the eye, a silent accusation passing between us. "You're the ranger for this section. You seen anything unusual? Heard anything? A man went missing on your watch today." Behind me, in the cabin, the floorboards creaked. Lucas was moving. I held Garrett's gaze, my mind racing. Every instinct screamed at me to tell him, to hand over the monster I was harboring. It was my duty. "The only unusual thing I've seen is 3 men with rifles trespassing on federal land," I said, my voice as cold as the rain. "There are no wolves in this park. You and your friends are going to turn around, go back to your truck, and wait for morning. If I see you with those rifles again, I'll arrest you myself." Garrett stared at me for a long moment, his jaw tight. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the anger, the grief, and the slight hesitation at challenging a federal officer. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "Fine," he said, the word clipped. "We'll make camp by the truck." He didn't need to say the rest. I knew they weren't leaving. They turned and disappeared back into the rainy darkness. But I could still feel their eyes on the cabin. The siege had begun. I closed the door, my back pressing against the solid wood as if it could hold the world at bay. I took a deep, shaky breath, the lie I'd told sitting like a stone in my stomach. When I turned around, Lucas was standing in the middle of the room. His gaze wasn't on me, but on the open journal lying on the floor. He didn't look angry or betrayed. He just looked tired. A kind of profound, soul-deep weariness that seemed to age him by decades. "You know," he said. It wasn't a question. "I know," I confirmed, my voice quiet. He sank onto the edge of the cot, burying his face in his hands. The silence stretched out, filled only by the drumming of the rain and the frantic beating of my own heart. I expected him to deny it, to rage, to do anything but sit there in utter, devastating defeat. "It's not a choice," he finally whispered, his voice muffled by his hands. "It's in my blood. A disease. My great-great-grandfather brought it over from somewhere in Eastern Europe. A story about a wolf, a bite, a curse. Every generation, one of the men in my family gets it." He looked up at me, his gray eyes pleading for me to understand. "I do everything I can to control it. I chart the lunar cycles. I have a place, a reinforced cellar miles from anyone. Every month I go there. I lock myself in and I wait for it to be over. It's agony, but it keeps people safe." He gestured vaguely toward the window, toward the dark, dripping forest. "This time, something went wrong. A grizzly came out of nowhere. I don't know if it smelled me or the change already starting in me. We fought. It clawed me up pretty good." He touched his bandaged chest. "The pain, the rage. It triggered an early transformation. A partial one. It wasn't complete. I wasn't myself. But I wasn't the other thing either. I was just pain and fear." His voice broke. I remember running. I remember shouting. And I remember a man, a hiker. He was just standing there, staring. I tried to warn him. I tried to tell him to run. He shook his head, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. That's the last thing I remember clearly. Just his face. And then, nothing but red. I woke up hours later, miles away, covered in my own blood and his. The horror of his confession hung in the air. This wasn't a monster. This was a man, trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake from, tormented by a memory he couldn't fully grasp. He fumbled in the pocket of his torn jeans and pulled out a small, ornate brass key. He held it out to me. "The cellar," he said, his voice a raw plea. "Your supply cellar beneath the cabin. The door, is it strong? Solid oak, reinforced frame. Lock me in there, Madison," he begged, pushing the key into my hand. "Please. And the box in my bag. The bullets." He swallowed hard. "If I get out, if I even sound like I'm getting out, don't hesitate. It's the only way. It would be a mercy." The brass key felt heavy in my hand, its weight pulling me down. It was more than a key. It was a burden, a choice I never asked for. My mind split into two warring factions. The cop in me, the ranger, saw the situation in black and white. An immediate, uncontrollable threat. Lucas had admitted in his own way to killing a man. He was about to transform into a creature of pure, violent instinct. My duty was clear. Neutralize the threat. Protect the public, in this case, Garrett and his men. The protocol was to call it in, secure the subject, and wait for backup. But the radio was dead. Backup was a day away, maybe more. And the protocol was what got David killed. We had a suspect cornered in an alley. Protocol was to wait for the SWAT team. David was by the book. He told me to hold my position, but I had a clear shot. I saw the suspect raise his gun. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, my mind caught between the rules and the reality staring me down. That hesitation was all it took. A flash of light, a deafening crack, and David was on the ground. I followed the protocol and my partner died. I looked at Lucas. He wasn't a suspect. He was a victim. A man pleading for help in the only way he knew how. He was asking me to be his jailer, and if necessary, his executioner. His eyes weren't the eyes of a monster. They were the eyes of a man facing his own firing squad, begging me to pull the trigger if he took one step out of line. Handing him over to Garrett's brand of frontier justice felt like a betrayal. They wouldn't see the man. They'd only see the beast that killed their friend. They'd tear him apart. "Please, Maddie," he whispered, using my nickname for the first time. It sounded achingly human. "There isn't much time." He was right. A tremor ran through his body, a violent shudder that wasn't from the cold. A low groan escaped his lips, deeper and more guttural than before. He was fighting it, but the tide was turning. In that moment, the war in my head was over. I wasn't a cop anymore. I wasn't just a ranger. I was the only person standing between a suffering man and a vengeful mob. I was done following the book. "All right," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "Let's go." I led him to the heavy wooden door in the floor behind my main counter. I pulled it open, revealing a set of steep wooden stairs leading down into the darkness. The air that rose up smelled of damp earth and canned goods. He descended without another word. As he reached the bottom, he turned and looked up at me. His face was contorted in pain. I could hear a faint, sickening sound like twigs snapping. It was the sound of his bones beginning to shift. "Maddie, thank you," he rasped, his voice already changing, becoming a gravelly growl. I slammed the heavy oak door shut, the sound echoing through the cabin. I slid the thick iron bolt into place and turned the brass key in the lock. The click was the most final sound I had ever heard. I left the key in the lock. Then I grabbed my tranquilizer rifle from the wall, checked the C02 cartridge, and took up a position by the window, my service pistol on the table beside it. I was no longer just protecting myself. I was guarding a prison, and a prisoner from the world outside, and from the monster I had just locked inside. The first sound from the cellar was a scream. It wasn't human. It was a long, drawn-out howl of pure, unadulterated agony, a sound that bypassed the ears and sank straight into the bone. It was followed by a wet, tearing noise that made my stomach churn, and then a series of sharp, cracking reports like a sledgehammer hitting a side of beef. It was the sound of a man being broken apart from the inside out. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it did no good. The horror was vibrating up through the floorboards. The heavy oak door began to shudder. A deep, percussive thump, thump, thump started. The rhythm of something immense and furious throwing itself against the wood. Splinters of wood puffed out from the edges of the door frame with each impact. The iron bolt was holding, but the wood around it was groaning in protest. Then, a new sound cut through the storm. A man's shout from outside. "Ranger, we heard that. What in God's name do you have in there?" It was Garrett. I scrambled to the window, peering through the rain-streaked glass. I could see 3 figures moving in the fog at the edge of the woods, the beams of their flashlights cutting erratic paths through the mist. They were fanning out, surrounding the cabin. "You lied to us." Garrett's voice was raw with fury. "It's in there with you, isn't it? The thing that killed Kevin." I grabbed my handheld radio from its charger. I keyed the mic, knowing full well the signal wouldn't reach the main dispatch, but Garrett and his men, likely monitoring park frequencies, would hear it. "This is Ranger Clark at Station 4, I said, my voice steady and official, a mask of professionalism over my terror. "I am under siege by 3 armed individuals at my location. Shots may be fired. I am requesting immediate backup. Repeat, immediate backup required at Station 4. It was a total bluff, but maybe it would give them pause. A rock shattered the window to my left, sending a spray of glass across the floor. I dropped to a crouch, my heart pounding.
"Give it up, Clark," another voice yelled. "Send the beast out and we'll leave you alone."
The pounding from the cellar intensified. A loud crack echoed through the cabin as a long, horizontal split appeared in the oak door. Claws, thick and black as obsidian, scrabbled in the opening, gouging deep furrows in the wood. A guttural roar of frustration and rage blasted up from the darkness below, a sound so powerful it rattled the jars on my shelves. Garrett and his men heard it too. One of them let out a yell of what sounded like a mix of terror and righteous anger. The beam of a flashlight pinned me through the broken window.
"Last chance, Ranger," Garrett roared. "That door's not gonna hold forever."
He was right. I was trapped in a flimsy wooden box between two different kinds of monsters, one born of a curse, the other of grief and vengeance. And the walls were closing in. The cellar door exploded, not with a simple crash, but a complete obliteration of wood and iron. The entire frame splintered, and the door itself was thrown across the room, smashing against my kitchen counter. For a heart-stopping second, there was only silence. Then a shape rose from the black square in the floor. It was huge, easily 7 feet tall, its frame a horrifying fusion of man and wolf. Its body was covered in coarse, dark fur, knotted with muscle that shifted and bunched under the skin. It stood on 2 digitigrade legs, balanced by a short, powerful tail. But the worst part was its head. The long, lupine snout was filled with dagger-like teeth, but its eyes held a terrifying, burning intelligence. They were filled with agony and a primal rage that seemed to set the very air on fire. The creature's gaze swept the room and locked onto me. For an infinitesimal moment, I saw a flicker of something else in those hellish yellow eyes. A glimmer of recognition of Lucas's horrified soul trapped within the monstrous form. Then it was gone, replaced by pure predatory instinct. It ignored me. Its head snapped toward the shattered window, its nostrils flaring as it caught the scent of the men outside. With a roar that shook the very foundations of the cabin, it launched itself through the opening in a shower of wood and glass. The night erupted into chaos. I heard screams, Garrett's men, of pure, undiluted terror. The beam of a flashlight spun wildly through the fog before clattering to the ground. The sharp crack of a hunting rifle split the air, followed by a howl of pain and rage from the beast. I grabbed my flare gun and my tranquilizer rifle and scrambled out the front door, into the maelstrom. The scene was something out of a nightmare. The beast was a whirlwind of dark fur and claws, moving with impossible speed. One of the hunters was on the ground, screaming and clutching his leg. The other was trying to reload his rifle, his hands shaking too badly to work the bolt. Garrett stood his ground, his face a pale mask in the darkness, firing his own rifle. The bullet seemed to only enrage the creature. It lunged, swiping a clawed hand that sent Garrett's rifle flying into the underbrush. I had to do something. I raised the flare gun and fired it straight up. The sky ignited with a brilliant temporary magnesium sun, casting long, dancing shadows across the clearing. The sudden light momentarily blinded everyone, including the beast, which reared back with a hiss. In that instant of confusion, I leveled the tranq rifle and fired at the hunter who was still trying to reload. The dart hit him squarely in the chest. His eyes went wide and he crumpled to the ground, out of the fight. The flare died, plunging us back into darkness. The beast shook its massive head and focused on the closest threat, Garrett, who was now unarmed and scrambling backward in the mud. The creature loomed over him, saliva dripping from its jaws, its claws raised for a final lethal strike. My voice was ripped from my throat, raw and desperate. I didn't scream stop or no. I screamed the only word that mattered. Lucas! The beast froze, its head cocked, its claws hovering inches from Garrett's throat. It turned its monstrous head and looked directly at me. And for the second time that night, I saw him, lost, terrified, and trapped behind the eyes of the monster. That single second of hesitation was all Garrett needed. He crab-walked backward, away from the death that had been breathing in his face. The spell was broken. The beast let out a frustrated roar and turned its attention back to the woods, to me. The creature took a step toward me, its massive form blocking out what little light there was. Its breath came in ragged, steaming pants. The rage was still there, but it was now mixed with confusion. The battle between the man and the beast was playing out across its face. This was my only chance. I stood my ground, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, my empty hands held out to my sides. But before it could take another step, a subtle change began in the air. The deep, oppressive black of the night was softening at the edges, shifting to a bruised indigo. The first, faint hint of dawn was breaking through the thick Washington clouds. A tremor went through the beast. It let out a low, agonized whine and staggered back. Its muscles began to knot and seize in violent, unnatural ways. It fell to its knees, throwing its head back in a silent scream as its body began to convulse. The sounds were even worse this time, the sickening crunch of bones reshaping themselves, the wet tearing of muscle and sinew pulling back into a human form. Fur receded into pale, clammy skin. The snout shortened, the claws retracted. It was a grotesque and agonizing reversal of the creation I had heard from the cellar. Garrett, still on the ground a dozen feet away, watched in stunned, horrified silence. His face, which had been a mask of vengeful fury, was now slack with disbelief. The monster he had been hunting, the beast that had torn his friend apart and nearly killed him, was melting away before his eyes. Within a minute, it was over. Lying naked and unconscious in the mud and pine needles was Lucas. He was covered in fresh wounds from the rifle shots and his own transformation, his body trembling with the aftershocks of the ordeal. The silence that followed was absolute. The rain had stopped. The only sound was the drip of water from the colossal trees and the ragged sound of our breathing. The hunter I'd tranquilized was still out cold. The other one, the one the beast had mauled, had apparently crawled off into the woods in a panic during the chaos. It was just the three of us, me, Garrett, and the man who was also a monster. Garrett slowly got to his feet, his eyes never leaving Lucas's vulnerable form. The hatred was gone, replaced by a profound, shell-shocked confusion. He looked at me, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. I walked over to Lucas and knelt beside him, checking his pulse. It was weak, but steady. He was alive. I had broken a dozen federal laws. I had harbored a fugitive, a killer technically. I had obstructed an investigation and discharged a weapon. I had made a choice, and the consequences were now laid bare in the pale morning light. My career was over. I might even go to jail. But Lucas was alive. Garrett was alive. Maybe it was the right choice after all. I looked up at Garrett, whose face was a canvas of warring emotions. My own voice was quiet but steady. "You're going to help me carry him inside," I said. It wasn't a request. He hesitated for only a second before giving a slow, jerky nod. "And then," I continued, my gaze unwavering, "we're going to figure out what the hell we tell the sheriff." The sun finally broke through the canopy, its rays spearing down into the clearing like a judgment. The night was over, but as Garrett and I lifted Lucas's limp body from the cold, wet earth, I knew our real problems were just beginning.